The Republic by Plato, Book 1, starting at 331e1. Last time, we left off Socrates talking to Cephalus, who was a good, just old man, about Cephalus's view of justice, which was always telling the truth and repaying your debts. And Socrates had an objection to that view. He said, there are some possible counterexamples, examples where you would be just in not paying your debts. For example, if somebody lent you a weapon or had you hold on to a weapon for them, then you would have to pay that back as sort of a debt. And yet, if they came back not in their right mind, then it would be unjust to give that weapon back to them. You should not give that weapon back to them. Therefore, we have a situation where you have a debt to be paid, and yet you should not pay that debt back. So this is a counterexample to Cephalus' view. Now, Cephalus had to leave, but he left Polemarchus, his son, and the heir of the argument, to take over for him. So let's pick up where Socrates was beginning to grill Polemarchus. Tell me then, O thou heir of the argument, what did Simonides say, and according to you truly say, about justice? He said the repayment of a debt is just, and in saying so, he appears to me to be right. I should be sorry to doubt the word of such a wise and inspired man. But his meaning, though probably clear to you, is the reverse of clear to me. For he certainly does not mean, as we were now saying, that I ought to return a deposit of arms or of anything else to one who asks for it when he's not in his right senses. And yet a deposit cannot be denied to be a debt? True. Then when the person who asks me is not in his right mind, I'm by no means to make the return? Certainly not. When Simonides said that the repayment of a debt was justice, he did not mean to include that. Certainly not, for he thinks that a friend ought always to do good to a friend and never evil. You mean that the return of a deposit of gold, which is to the injury of the receiver, if the two parties are friends, is not the repayment of a debt. That is what you would imagine he would say? Yes. So Polemarchus believes that doing good to a friend is a kind of debt. Now he has two kind of options here. He could say that the returning of arms is a debt and the doing good to your friend is a debt, and the one trumps the other, right? The doing good to your friend trumps the giving back of a weapon. Now, why the one trumps the other would take a little bit of explaining Why the one trumps the other would take a little bit of explaining, but his answer here would be, oh yes, it is a debt. However, one is less than the other, so we should always do good to a friend. That's a bigger debt. However, that's not the option he chooses. Notice Socrates asks him pointedly, returning something that would be to the injury of a friend would not be a debt, right? So here's what Polemarchus appears to be claiming here. The debt really is to always do good to your friends, and one good thing to do to them is to return the things that they lent you so long as it won't cause them harm. Now, this answer does have the benefit that you don't have to explain why one debt is greater than the other one, but it does have the drawback that it seems to change the view a little bit. It no longer seems like we're saying that to be just is to pay a debt. Now it seems like we're saying to be just is to do good to your friends. And Socrates will point this out in a few lines. And are enemies also to receive what we owe to them? To be sure, he said. They're to receive what we owe to them, and an enemy, as I take it, owes to an enemy that which is due or proper to him. That is to say, evil. Now, he didn't really need to go there, right? He could have said that we don't owe anything to enemies, or he could have even said that we also owe good to enemies as well, although that answer would be a little post-Jesus Christ, so I don't know that he would think about that kind of a thing. Simonides then, after the manner of poets, would seem to have spoken darkly of the nature of justice, for he really meant to say that justice is the giving to each man what is proper to him. And this he termed a debt. In other words, before we said that justice was repaying debts, now it seems like we're saying justice is giving to each person what they should get. So this view, which Polemarchus is sort of having to take up, is a little different than his dad, than Cephalus' view. And Socrates will point out three objections to this view. Number one, justice is a skill, which is incompatible with this definition of justice. Number two, we have mistakes of judgment. And number three, it is never just to do evil to anyone. That must have been his meaning, he said. By heaven, I replied. And if we asked him what due or proper thing is given by medicine, And to whom? What answer do you think that he would make to us? He would surely reply that medicine gives drugs and meat and drink to the human bodies. And what due or proper thing is given by cookery? And to what? Seasoning to food. And what is that which justice gives? And to whom? If, Socrates, we are to be guided at all by the analogy of the preceding instances, then justice is the art which gives good to friends and evil to enemies. So here's the beginning of our objection, that justice is a skill, and this definition of justice is incompatible with justice being a skill. Number one, justice is a skill or a craft or an art or something like that. The Greek word is techne. Number two, these arts or crafts or whatever you call them. Number two, these skills or crafts or arts or whatever you want to call them give some particular due or proper thing to a particular thing. For example, medicine gives drug or food or drink to the human body. Cookery gives seasoning to food. Three, so justice gives something due or proper to a particular kind of thing. Four, let's assume for the moment, provisionally assume, that's what that PA is going to stand for, provisionally assume that justice gives good to friends and evil to enemies. Understand what Socrates is doing here. He's not saying that this is true. He's saying, let's assume that it's true, and he's going to show how this is going to lead to something absurd. That is his meaning then? I think so. And who is best able to do good to friends and evil to his enemies in time of sickness? The physician. Or when they're on a voyage amid the perils of the sea? The pilot. All right, premise 5, certain skills bring good or evil to specific people in specific situations. So, for example, the physician brings good or evil to his patients when they are sick. The pilot or captain brings the good or evil to sailors when they are sailing. And in what sorts of actions, or with a view to what result, is the just man most able to do harm to his enemy and good to his friends? In going to war against the one, and in making alliances with the other. Number 6, let's provisionally assume for the moment, that justice is like one of these kinds of skills. There's another kind of skill that we'll examine in a moment here. But for now, we're just going to see, is justice this kind of skill? Number 7, so it must bring good or evil to a particular kind of person in a particular situation. Number 8, the best candidate would be, it brings a good or evil to a friend or enemy in war. But when a man is well, my dear Polemarchus, there's no need for a physician? No. And he who is not on a voyage has no need of a pilot? No. So premise number 9, these kinds of skills can't bring good or evil outside of those specific times. So the physician brings good or evil to patients when sick, but can't do so when they're healthy. The captain brings good or ill to the sailors when they're sailing, but can't do so when they're not sailing, when they're on land. Then, in time of peace, justice will be of no use. Number 10, so justice can't bring good or evil outside of its specific time, which of course is peacetime. So, if justice is like these kinds of skills, then it's useless during peacetime. I'm very far from thinking so. You think that justice may be of use in peace as well as in war? Yes. Number 12, justice is useful during peacetime. 13, therefore, justice is not one of these kinds of skills. It's not the kind of skill that brings good or evil to a specific kind of person in a specific situation. Like husbandry for the acquisition of corn? Yeah. Or like shoemaking for the acquisition of shoes? That's what you mean. Yeah. And what similar use or power of acquisition has justice in time of peace? Number 14, some kinds of skills bring good or evil through the acquisition of something. For example, farming with the acquisition of food, or shoemaking with the acquisition of shoes. So 15, let's provisionally assume, let's assume for right now, that justice is one of these kinds of skills. That would mean it must bring good or evil through the acquisition of some kind of thing. In contracts, Socrates, justice is of use. And by contracts, you mean partnership. Exactly. So, premise 17, justice acquires contracts/partnerships. But is the just man or the skillful player a more useful and better partner at a game of drafts? The skillful player. For our purposes, instead of drafts, you could just think chess. So in other words, the objection here is, if you're playing chess and you have a partner, do you want that partner to be a just partner, or do you want that partner to be a chess master? Now, it may seem like he's cheating here, like, well, why can't I have both, right? Maybe having both is important. But remember, he's trying to figure out what is the nature of justice. So it's very important that the just person being good at acquiring these kinds of partnerships explains why that is useful. And in the laying of bricks and stones, is the just man a more useful or better partner than the builder? Well, quite the reverse. Then in what sort of partnership is the just man a better partner than a harp player? As in playing the harp player is certainly a better partner than the just man. In a money partnership. So we're going to have to refine premise 17 here. We'll say that justice acquires contracts or partnerships of money. Yes, Polemarchus, but surely not in the use of money. For you don't want a just man to be your counselor on the purchase or sale of a horse. A man who is knowing about horses would be better for that, would he not? Certainly. And when you want to buy the shipwright or the pilot would be better. True. Objection 1 here, in spending money, a person who knows about the thing bought is more useful than a just person. Then what is that joint use of silver or gold in which the just man is to be preferred? When you want a deposit to be kept safely. You mean when money is not wanted, but allowed to lie? Allowed to lie meaning allowed to just sit there. Precisely. That is to say, justice is useful when money becomes useless? That's the inference. And when you want to keep a pruning hook safe, then justice is useful to the individual and to the state. But when you want to use it, then the art of the vine dresser? Clearly. And when you want to keep a shield or a lyre and not use them, you would say that justice is useful. But when you want to use them, then the art of the soldier or of the musician? Certainly. And so of all other things, justice is useful when they are useless, and useless when they are useful? That's the inference. The justice is not good for much. So we have further refined 17 to say, justice acquires contracts or partnerships of money in regards to the guarding or defending of that money. Now, there are actually going to be two objections to this view of justice as this kind of a skill, as the skill for acquiring good things. First one being that it seems like it makes justice of little use. You only need to defend your things when they're not being used. When things are not being used, then they are not useful. So justice is useful when the things that you are defending are not useful. So justice is not very useful. Now this is obviously logically fallacious. You can't infer justice's uselessness at a time from the item's uselessness at that time. Further, it's obviously false. It is useful to keep your money defended when you're not using it. And in fact, if you think about it, when you use money, it's just gone in an instant, right? The actual use of the money is almost instantaneous. So for all of the lifespan of that money being in your hands, justice is very important. The thing is, Polemarchus is just getting owned here, right? He's a youngster and Socrates is taking him to school. That's going to be important a little bit later on. But let us consider this further point. Is not he who can best strike a blow in a boxing match or in any kind of fighting best able to ward off that blow? Certainly. And he who is most skillful in preventing or escaping from a disease is best able to create one? True. And he is the best guard of a camp, who is best able to steal a march upon the enemy? Certainly. Then he who is a good keeper of anything is also a good thief? That, I suppose, is to be inferred? Then if the just man is good at keeping money, he is good at stealing it. That's implied by the argument. Then after all, the just man has turned out to be a thief. And this is a lesson which I suspect you must have learned out of Homer. For he, speaking out of Autolycus, the maternal grandfather of Odysseus, who was a favorite of his, affirms that he was excellent above all men in theft and perjury. And so, you and Homer and Simonides are agreed that justice is an art of theft, to be practiced, however, for the good of friends and for the harm of enemies. That was what you were saying. Here's objection 2, is that this view leads to absurdity. And here is Socrates' argument. In a skill, the person best able to defend the thing is the person that does the thing she's defending against. For example, defending a blow in boxing and the person that excels in striking the blow. Defending against a disease and the person that excels in creating the disease. Defending a camp from being marched upon and the person who excels at marching upon camps. Now, this again is obviously false. If you ever watch baseball, you'll know that pitchers are horrific hitters. And you would think, knowing what they do, you would think that they'd be really good hitters, but that's not the case. In any case, number 2, so the person best able to defend from thievery is the thief himself. Number 3, so the just person is the thief. Or maybe we should say makes partnerships with thieves. Now, Socrates has made his case that justice can't be this kind of skill, the kind of skill that acquires good things. So remember at the very beginning of this, we provisionally assumed that justice was giving good to friends and evil to enemies. Assuming that, we've just shown that justice can't be one of these two kinds of skills. But remember, we said in the number 1 that justice is a skill. Well, we have a contradiction here. Therefore, it can't be the case that justice is giving good to friends and evil to enemies. Of course, the obvious response here is that there might be other kinds of skills. To make that response stick, we're going to have to think of what other kinds of skills there might be, and Socrates doesn't really get into that. No, certainly not that. Though I do not know what I did say, but I still stand by the latter words. Well, there's another question. By friends and enemies, do we mean those who are so really, or are only in seeming? Surely, he said, a man may be expected to love those whom he thinks good, and to hate those whom he thinks evil. Yes, but do not persons often err about good and evil? Many who are not good seem to be so, and conversely? That's true. This is the beginning of our second objection, mistakes of judgment. Provisionally assume that justice is giving good to friends and evil to enemies. We often err about who is our friend and who is our enemy. Then to them, the good will be the enemies and the evil will be their friends? True. And in that case, they will be right in doing good to the evil and evil to the good? Clearly. Number 3, so in these cases, we should do evil to friends and good to enemies. But the good are just and would not do an injustice? True. Then according to your argument, it's just to injure those who do no wrong? Number 4, so it is just to help enemies and harm friends. Nay, Socrates, the doctrine is immoral. Then I suppose that we ought to do good to the just and harm to the unjust? I like that better. But see the consequence. Many a man who is ignorant of human nature has friends who are bad friends, and in that case, he ought to do harm to them, and he has good enemies whom he ought to benefit. But if so, we shall be saying the very opposite of that which we affirm to be the meaning of Simonides. Very true, he said, and I think we'd ought better correct an error into which we seem to have fallen in the use of the words friend and enemy. What was the error, Polemarchus? I asked. We assumed that he is a friend who seems to be or who is thought good. And how is the error corrected? We should rather say that he is a friend who is as well as seems good, and that he who seems only and is not good only seems to be and is not a friend. And of an enemy the same may be said. In other words, Polemarchus' response here is that we don't talk about seems to be friends but are actually friends. So we can recast this argument as follows. Premise 1, provisionally assume that justice is doing good to those who seem to be our friends and who actually are our friends, and justice is doing evil to those who seem to be our enemies and actually are our enemies. We often err about who is our friend and our enemy, but still, we ought to do good to those who we believe to be our friends and are our friends, and evil to those who we believe to be our enemies and are our enemies. You would argue that the good are our friends and the bad are our enemies? Yes. And instead of saying simply as we did at first, that it is just to do good to our friends and harm to our enemies, we should further say it is just to do good to our friends when they are good, and harm to our enemies when they are evil. Yeah, that appears to me to be the truth. But ought the just to injure anyone at all? Well, undoubtedly he ought to injure those who are both wicked and his enemies. When horses are injured, are they improved or deteriorated? The latter. Deteriorated, that is to say, in the good qualities of horses, not dogs. Yes, of horses. And dogs are deteriorated in the good qualities of dogs and not of horses? Of course. That last objection goes to Polemarchus. He successfully navigated that one. He got a successful response to that. So Socrates throws out a different objection, which is that the just person would never do evil to his enemies because he would never do evil to anyone. Now notice, this would leave intact the idea that the just man does good to his friends, and possibly allow that the just man doesn't do good or evil to his enemies. Here's how this argument starts though. Number one, an injury deteriorates a thing only in the qualities proper to that thing. So for example, a horse in the qualities of a horse and not a dog. You wouldn't say that a horse was injured because he couldn't go play fetch, right? Or a dog in the qualities of a dog and not a horse. You wouldn't say that a dog was injured because it couldn't run as fast as a horse. And will not men who are injured be deteriorated in that which is the proper virtue of man? The conclusion here being an injury to a human is only an injury in those qualities that are proper to a human, certainly. And that human virtue is justice? So premise 3, the quality proper to a human is justice. To be sure, then men who are injured are of necessity made unjust. So humans can only be injured in their justice. In other words, they can only be made unjust. This is so obviously false, it's crazy. Obviously, we can be injured in ways that don't make us unjust, right? My buddy JP just broke his foot skateboarding down the lowers. It's not like all of a sudden he is an unjust person because he has a broken foot. What's up, JP? Now, remember here that Plato is setting this up. This is a glaring error, and Polemarchus doesn't catch it. But Plato must have seen it, so why did Plato put it there? Why would Plato have Polemarchus assent to such a thing? Well, one possible reason is because he's a young buck, right? He's trying to show us that Socrates is here arguing with this guy about justice, and Polemarchus's head is spinning. So what would that leave Polemarchus feeling about justice? It may have him feeling a little skeptical about justice, right? And remember, one of the reasons that Socrates was executed was for corruption of the youth. Maybe Plato is showing us that, okay, maybe Socrates did have a little bit of an effect on the youth. Not to say that Plato thinks that Socrates was doing so intentionally, but maybe this methodology doesn't work for young people. I'm not sure I agree. I've taught young people for a long time now, and I think asking questions about what is justice is important for them. I think it helps them to think through things, but I also can kind of see how at times it could make them feel like, oh, what is this all about, right? Like, oh my gosh, I thought I knew what we're talking about. Let's throw it all out. So maybe kind of a yes or no? I don't know. That is the result. But can the musician by his art make men unmusical? Certainly not. Or the horseman by his art make them bad horsemen? Impossible. In other words, premise 5 here, a skill doesn't make others the opposite of that skill. And can the just by justice make men unjust? Or speaking general, can the good by virtue make them bad? Assuredly not. Okay, so 6, a just man can't make another person unjust. Any more than heat can produce cold? It cannot. Or drought moisture? Clearly not. Nor can the good harm anyone? Impossible. And the just is the good? Certainly. Then to injure a friend or anyone else is not the act of a just man, but of the opposite, who is the unjust? All right. And there's the payoff for Socrates. Therefore, it is never just to harm, it is always unjust. Now, you may think that this sets up sort of like a weird, like you're either 100% just or 100% unjust. That's not necessarily what Socrates is claiming here. What he's saying is the just person, through his justice, right? Through his just, when he's acting just, can't make someone unjust. If a just person were to injure a person and therefore make them unjust, they would be acting out of a portion of themselves that was unjust, not out of their justice. In the same way that, for example, the musician could teach you how to play music poorly, but not through his musical gift. It would be through the reverse of that. I think what you say is quite true, Socrates. Then if a man says that justice consists in the repayment of debts, and that good is the debt which a man owes to his friends, and evil the debt which he owes to his enemies, to say this is not wise, for it's not true, if, as has been clearly shown, the injuring of another can be in no case just. I agree with you, said Polemarchus. Then you and I are prepared to take up arms against anyone who attributes such a saying to Simonides or Bias or Pittacus, or any other wise man or seer. Notice, by the way, he just said that harming others is unjust. And now he's saying they would be willing to harm people that hold this other doctrine. So Plato is making Socrates really sloppy here. I'm quite ready to do battle at your side, he said. Shall I tell you whose I believe the saying to be? Whose? I believe that Periander, or Perdiccas, or Xerxes, or Ismenias the Theban, or some other rich and mighty man who had a great opinion of his own power, was the first to say that justice is doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies. Most true, he said. Yes, I said, but if this definition of justice also breaks down, what other can be offered? Several times in the course of the discussion, Thrasymachus had made an attempt to get the argument into his own hands, and had been put down by the rest of the company who wanted to hear the end. But when Polemarchus and I had done speaking, and there was a pause, he could no longer hold his peace, and gathering himself up, he came at us like a wild beast, seeking to devour us. We were quite panic-stricken at the sight of him. Those are the three objections that Socrates levels against Polemarchus's view of justice as giving good to friends and evil to enemies. Most commentators will point out that it seems like the fault here with Socrates is that he's assuming that justice is a techne, that it's a kind of art or craft or skill. Why think so? It doesn't seem to be obviously true. In the next video, we're going to see Thrasymachus give a third possibility for justice, and he's going to be a lot more insistent upon it. It's going to be very enjoyable. Stay tuned. I'll see you in the next video.